The early morning frost clung to the tall grass of Whispering Pine Valley as Elijah Blackwood completed his dawn patrol of the northern fence line. His weathered face, creased by 45 years of harsh Montana winters and unforgiving summers, revealed little emotion as he surveyed his 15,000 acres. The Blackwood Ranch stood as a testament to stubborn perseverance in a land that took more often than it gave. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elijah's mare, a sturdy chestnut named Penny, snorted as they created the ridge that offered a panoramic view of his sprawling property. The ranch house sat nestled against the backdrop of the granite mountains, smoke curling from the chimney where Mrs. Holloway would be preparing breakfast. 3 barn hands would be tending to the morning chores, and foreman Thomas Reed would be organizing the day's cattle rotation. It was a scene of perfect order, maintained with military precision. Elijah had built this life through discipline and unyielding routine. Every decision, every movement had its purpose, a carefully constructed bulwark against the chaos that had once shattered his world. "Oh, come on, girl," he murmured to Penny, turning her toward home. "Let's get back before Mrs. Holloway starts hollering." The sun was just cresting the eastern peaks as Elijah approached the main house, its 2 stories of sturdy timber and stone, standing defiant against the wilderness that surrounded it. He dismounted with practiced ease, despite the old bullet wound in his thigh that ached in the morning chill. "Morning, Mr. Blackwood," called Samuel Jenkins, the youngest ranch hand, as he hauled water to the horse trough. "Reed's saying we ought to move the north herd today. Storms coming in from the west." Elijah nodded once, acknowledging the information without breaking stride. His interactions with the hands were always the same, brief, professional, and devoid of unnecessary pleasantries. They respected him, feared him perhaps, but none would claim to know him. Inside, the house was warm and filled with the aroma of coffee and frying bacon. Mrs. Holloway, a stern widow in her 60s, who had run Elijah's household for the past 8 years, barely looked up from the stove as he entered. "You're late. Food's getting cold." This was their morning ritual, her mild scolding and his silence in response. He hung his coat and hat on the hook by the door, placed his rifle in the rack with methodical care, and took his seat at the head of the large oak table. The dining room, like every room in the Blackwood house, was meticulously maintained, but frozen in time. A girl's jacket still hung by the door, too small for any adult. A collection of hand-carved wooden animals lined the mantelpiece, gathering dust despite Mrs. Holloway's diligent cleaning. A portrait hung above the fireplace, Elijah, younger and less severe, standing beside a slender woman with kind eyes and a dark-haired girl about 10 years old, her smile revealing a missing front tooth. Mrs. Holloway placed a plate before him. 3 eggs, 4 strips of bacon and 2 biscuits, arranged in the exact same pattern as every morning for the past 8 years. "Reed wants to move the north herd," Elijah said, breaking the silence as he poured his coffee. "Tell him to go ahead, but keep the men close to the buildings. That storm looks mean." Mrs. Holloway nodded, making a note in the small book she kept in her apron pocket. She managed the household with the same precision Elijah demanded of his. "Ranch operations. Sheriff Thompson rode by yesterday while you were out," she said, refilling his cup. "Said there was trouble on the overland trail. Wagon train got hit about 20 miles east," Elijah grunted, neither surprised nor particularly concerned. The Montana Territory in 1876 was still wild country. Indian raids, outlaw attacks, and natural disasters were common hazards for those foolish enough to seek their fortunes in the West. "Not our concern," he replied, returning to his breakfast. Mrs. Holloway's mouth tightened into a thin line. "He said there were women and children, Mr. Blackwood." The only sign that her words had any effect was the slight pause before Elijah took his next bite. 8 years ago, such news would have spurred him to action, gathering men, supplies, riding Out to help. 8 years ago, before the raid that took his wife and daughter, Elijah Blackwood had been a different man. "The army will handle it," he said flatly, rising from the table. "I'll be checking the south pasture. Have Reed meet me there at noon." He was halfway to the door when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention. Visitors to Blackwood Ranch were rare and seldom welcome. Elijah moved to the window, his hand instinctively checking the revolver at his hip. Sheriff William Thompson and his deputy, young Mark Collins, were riding up the path to the house, leading a third horse with a small figure slumped in the saddle. Elijah's jaw tightened. Whatever Thompson was bringing to his doorstep, it meant complications, and Elijah Blackwood had spent 8 years eliminating complications from his life. "Mrs. Holloway, we have company," he said, his voice betraying no emotion. "Prepare the guest room." The housekeeper looked startled. In 8 years, the guest room had never been used. Outside, Sheriff Thompson dismounted, his weathered face grim as he approached. The deputy stayed with the third horse, helping the small figure to the ground. "Blackwood," Thompson nodded in greeting. At 55, the sheriff had served the county for over 2 decades. He and Elijah had a history that stretched back to when both were younger men, fighting in the war together before settling in the territory. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying," Elijah said, blocking the entrance to his home. Thompson sighed, pushing back his hat. "Not selling anything, Eli. Asking for help." Elijah's eyes moved to the small figure now walking toward them, supported by Deputy Collins. A girl, perhaps 12 or 13, with tangled dark hair and clothes stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Her face was blank, eyes staring ahead without seeming to see. "The wagon train I told Mrs. Holloway about," Thompson explained. "Renegade Blackfoot hit them yesterday morning. By the time Army Patrol found them, this little one was the only one left alive, hidden under a false bottom in one of the wagons." Something, cold and unwelcome, stirred in Elijah's chest as he looked at the girl. Her vacant stare and rigid posture were painfully familiar, the same shock he'd seen in his own reflection 8 years ago. "Take her to the fort," he said, turning away, "or to Pine Creek. The Reverend's wife takes in strays." Thompson stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We tried the fort. The army surgeon says she hasn't spoken a word, won't eat, barely sleep, just stares like that. The Reverend's wife has 6 orphans already from the influenza outbreak last winter. And what do you expect me to do with her?" Elijah demanded, a rare crack in his controlled facade. Thompson met his gaze steadily. "You've got space, Eli. You've got means. And God knows you understand what she's going through better than anyone in the territory." Elijah felt an old fury rising in him. "Don't you dare use Sarah and Emma against me, Will. Not for this." At the mention of those names that were never spoken at Blackwood Ranch, Mrs. Holloway appeared in the doorway, her expression softening as she spotted the girl. "Oh, the poor lamb," she murmured, moving past Elijah. "Come inside, child. We'll get you cleaned up and fed." The girl didn't respond, and didn't even seem to register Mrs. Holloway's presence until the older woman gently took her arm. Then she flinched violently, pulling away with a small, animal-like sound of fear. "She's been like that since we found her," Deputy Collins explained. "Doc Winters gave her something to help her sleep last night, but she woke up screaming. Took 2 nurses to calm her down." Mrs. Holloway knelt slowly before the girl, making no attempt to touch her again. "My name is Agnes Holloway, child. This is Blackwood Ranch. You're safe here." For the first time, a flicker of awareness passed through the girl's vacant eyes. She looked at Mrs. Holloway, then at the house behind her, and finally at Elijah. Something in his stern countenance seemed to register with her. Perhaps she recognized the same grief she carried. "What's her name?" Mrs. Holloway asked the sheriff. Thompson shook his head. "Don't know. Like I said, she hasn't spoken. Army found a journal in the wagon she was hiding in. Belongs to a James and Mary Parker, traveling from Ohio with their daughter. Catherine, we're assuming that's her, but can't be certain." Catherine, Mrs. Holloway repeated softly. "That's a lovely name." The girl showed no reaction to the name. She simply stood there, swaying slightly with exhaustion, her eyes now fixed on Elijah with an unsettling intensity. Elijah felt trapped by that gaze. In her eyes, he saw the same hollowness that had consumed him after finding his own family, the same silence that had nearly driven him mad in those first terrible months. "One night," he said abruptly. "She can stay one night. Then you take her to Pine Creek, or send word to the fort that they need to make arrangements." Without waiting for a response, he turned and strode toward the stables, ignoring Mrs. Holloway's disapproving look and Thompson's knowing sigh. The storm hit Blackwood Ranch just after sunset, bringing howling winds and sheets of icy rain that rattled the windows of the main house. Elijah sat in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk before him, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a child in his home again. Mrs. Holloway had spent the afternoon attempting to coax her girl, Catherine, if that was indeed her name, to eat, to bathe, to show any sign that she was still present in her traumatized body. Her efforts had yielded little success until, surprisingly, Thomas Reed's appearance had sparked a reaction. The foreman had come to the house to report on the cattle, his massive frame filling the kitchen doorway. At the sight of him, the girl had suddenly become animated, backing away in terror, her hands raised as if to ward off a blow. "It's the beard," Mrs. Holloway had explained later, after Reed hastily retreated. "The sheriff said some of the attackers had heavy beards. Poor child probably associates it with those savages." Now, as the storm raged outside, Elijah heard soft footsteps in the hallway. Not Mrs. Holloway's familiar tread, but something lighter, hesitant. He rose from his desk just as the study door creaked open a few inches. The girl stood in the doorway, her small figure illuminated by the firelight. Mrs. Holloway had managed to get her into a clean nightgown, one of Emma's, preserved like a relic in the chest at the foot of his daughter's untouched bed. The sight of it on this stranger's body sent a jolt of irrational anger through Elijah. "You should be in bed," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. The girl didn't flinch at his tone. Instead, she took a tentative step into the room, her eyes moving slowly over the bookshelves, the maps on the wall, the worn leather chair by the fire. When a particularly loud crack of thunder shook the house, she moved with surprising speed to the farthest corner of the room, pressing her back against the wall, eyes wide with fear. Elijah recognized the reaction, not just fear of the storm, but the instinctive search for defensible position, back to the wall, eyes on all possible entrances. It was how he had lived for months after the raid. "It's just thunder," he said, making no move toward her. "You're safe in here." The words felt foreign on his tongue, hollow promises he had no business making. He hadn't been able to keep his own family safe. What right did he have to offer this child assurances? The girl slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, knees pulled tight to her chest, watching him with those unsettlingly aware eyes. Despite her fear, there was something evaluating in her gaze, as if she were taking his measure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elijah sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Mrs. Holloway put you in the guest room." A slight nod, the first direct response she'd given to any question. "It's the safest room in the house," he continued, surprised to find himself wanting to fill the silence. "Thick walls, small window was too high for anyone to climb through. Door is solid oak with a good lock." He was describing it like a fortress, he realized, not a bedroom. But the girl seemed to relax slightly at this information, her death grip on her knees loosening a fraction. Another crash of thunder and her eyes squeezed shut, body tensing again. Before he could think better of it, Elijah crossed to the bookshelf and pulled down a worn volume. "My daughter," He stopped, clearing his throat. I used to read this during storms. Helps drown out the thunder. He opened the book, searching for a particular passage, then began to read in his deep, steady voice. In the central place of our dwelling, there was a crystal lobster. I protected her during the storm, sitting up all night, waiting for the cats to come. It was nonsense, really, a story Emma had loved for its strangeness. But as he read, the girl's rigid posture gradually eased. Her eyes remained fixed on him, but the terror in them dimmed, replaced by something like curiosity. When Mrs. Holloway appeared in the doorway half an hour later, she found an extraordinary scene. Elijah Blackwood, who had spoken perhaps 50 words a day for the past 8 years, reading aloud from his daughter's favorite book, while the traumatized girl sat wrapped in a quilt from his chair, her eyes heavy with approaching sleep. "I've prepared a tray for the child," Mrs. Holloway said softly. "Some broth and bread." Elijah closed the book, suddenly self-conscious. "Good, she needs to eat." The sound of Mrs. Holloway's voice seemed to break whatever fragile connection had formed. The girl's expression shuttered, the vacant look returning. As she pulled the quilt tighter around herself, "Come, child," Mrs. Holloway coaxed. "Just a few spoonfuls. You need your strength." The girl didn't move, and didn't acknowledge the housekeeper at all. Her eyes remained fixed on Elijah, as if he were the only safe object in a dangerous world. Elijah felt the weight of that trust, like a physical burden. He wanted no part of it, had spent 8 years ensuring no one depended on him in any meaningful way. And yet, he found himself saying, "Bring the tray in here, Mrs. Holloway. She can eat by the fire." The housekeeper's eyebrows rose in surprise, but she nodded and disappeared to fetch the food. "This changes nothing," Elijah told the girl, once they were alone again. "Tomorrow you'll go to Pine Creek. The Reverend and his wife are good people. They'll find you a proper home." The girl's expression didn't change, but she shook her head once, definitively. "You can't stay here," he insisted, an uncomfortable desperation creeping into his voice. "This isn't a place for children anymore." She continued to stare at him, silent and unmoving, her message clear despite her lack of words. She had no intention of going anywhere. When Mrs. Holloway returned with the tray, the girl accepted the bowl of broth without protest. She ate slowly, mechanically, her eyes still tracking Elijah as he paced before the fire. "We'll need to inform the sheriff if there are any relatives to be contacted," Mrs. Holloway said, watching the girl with a mixture of concern and professional assessment. "Though if she was traveling from Ohio, I expect they're rather far away." Elijah grunted, still caught in the grip of unwelcome memories. The sight of the girl in Emma's nightgown, sitting in his study, eating from one of their family bowls. It was like watching a ghost inhabit his carefully ordered existence. "The sheriff said they found a journal," he said abruptly. "Did he leave it?" Mrs. Holloway nodded. "It's in the kitchen. I didn't think it was right to read it without permission." "Bring it here. If we're to help her, we need to know who she is." He caught himself too late. "We, not they," as if he had already decided to be part of whatever happened next. Mrs. Holloway returned with a small leather-bound book, its pages water-stained but still legible. The girl's eyes widened at the sight of it, and she set down her bowl, reaching for the journal with the first true urgency she'd shown. Mrs. Holloway handed it to her, and the girl clutched it to her chest, rocking slightly. "Yours?" Elijah asked, quietly. She shook her head, then nodded, a complicated gesture that suggested both yes and no. "Her mother's, perhaps," Mrs. Holloway suggested. "May I?" She held out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation the girl surrendered the journal. Mrs. Holloway opened it carefully, turning to the first page. "Property of Mary Elizabeth Parker," she read. "Journey begun April 12, 1876, from Columbus, Ohio, to Montana Territory." She turned a few more pages, scanning the neat handwriting. "Seems to be a record of their travels. Daily entries about..." Weather, landmarks, fellow travelers. The girl was watching intently, her face showing the first signs of emotion beyond fear, a yearning, a desperate connection to the words being read from her mother's hand. "Here's something," Mrs. Holloway said near the middle of the book. "Catherine turned 13 today. James carved her a little horse from pine wood. She named it Thaddeus after her grandfather. She says—" Mrs. Holloway broke off, looking up at the girl with sudden understanding. "She says she's going to start her own journal when we reach Montana to record their new life." Catherine, if that was truly her name, had begun to tremble, silent tears tracking down her pale cheeks. It was the first time she had cried since being found, according to Sheriff Thompson. Elijah felt something crack in the careful fortress he had built around his heart. The girl's silent grief was too familiar, too much a mirror of his own long-suppressed pain. "That's enough for tonight," he said roughly. "She needs rest." Mrs. Holloway nodded, closing the journal. "I'll stay with her until she falls asleep." "No," Elijah said, surprising himself as much as his housekeeper. "I'll do it. You've been up since dawn, and tomorrow will be difficult with the storm damage." Mrs. Holloway studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "As you wish, Mr. Blackwood. I'll leave her tray on the sideboard. Try to get her to finish the broth if you can." After she left, Elijah stood awkwardly in the center of his study, unsure how to proceed. The girl, Catherine, had stopped crying, but her eyes remained bright with unshed tears, her small body rigid with contained emotion. "You should finish eating," he said finally. "Then sleep. Tomorrow will come soon enough." Catherine made no move toward the abandoned bowl. Instead, she looked pointedly at the book Elijah had set aside. "You want me to keep reading?" A nod, small but unmistakable. Elijah hesitated, then picked up the book again. A few more pages. Then sleep. As he resumed reading, the girl gradually relaxed, the tension in her small frame easing with each page. By the time the storm had moved eastward, leaving only a gentle rain pattering against the windows, Catherine's eyes had drifted closed, her head resting against the arm of the chair. Elijah set the book aside, studying her face in repose. Her resemblance to Emma that had so disturbed him earlier was less pronounced now. This girl was taller, thinner, with a scatter of freckles across her nose that his daughter had never had. Her hair, now clean, was a lighter brown, not Emma's raven. "Black, you're not her," he whispered, as much to himself as to the sleeping child, "and I'm not the man who can help you." Yet as he carefully lifted her slight form and carried her up to the guest room, the room that had never been used in 8 years of disuse, Elijah Blackwood couldn't escape the feeling that something long dormant within him had begun to stir. Like spring grass pushing through the last crust of winter snow, dawn broke over Blackwood Ranch with the golden clarity that follows a heavy storm. Elijah stood on the porch, surveying the damage, a section of corral fencing down, shingles torn from the stable roof, and the creek that ran through his property swollen to twice its normal size. He'd been up since 4, unable to sleep with the weight of decisions pressing upon him. "Reed says the bridge to Pine Creek is washed out," Mrs. Holloway announced from the doorway, coffee cup in hand. "Won't be possible for at least 3 days, maybe a week." Elijah accepted the cup without comment, though his jaw tightened at the news. The bridge being out meant the girl, Catherine, would remain at Blackwood Ranch longer than his promised. "One night." Mrs. Holloway's satisfied expression told him she considered this a fortunate development. "How is she?" he asked finally. "Still sleeping. Poor thing was exhausted. I've laid out some of Emma's old things. They might be a bit small, but they'll do until we can get to town." Mrs. Holloway met his glare with steady composure. "Would you prefer she wear that blood-stained dress she arrived in, or perhaps go about in her nightgown?" Before Elijah could respond, Thomas Reed approached from the direction of the stables. The foreman removed his hat as he came up the porch steps, revealing premature gray streaking his dark hair. "Morning, Mr. Blackwood. We've got trouble with the North herd. Lightning spooked them bad. They've scattered halfway to Jackson's property. Samuel and the boys are trying to round them up, but we're short-handed with Porter laid up with that broken arm." Elijah drained his coffee. "I'll ride out. Have Matthews prepare my gear." Reed hesitated, glancing toward the house. "Sheriff Thompson stopped by the bunkhouse early this morning. He was checking on the girl. Said to tell you he's sending word to the army at Fort Wallace about her, but it might be a few days before they can send someone. The storm hit them hard, too." "Fine." Elijah handed his empty cup to Mrs. Holloway. "We'll deal with it when they come. Until then, keep her out of my way." As he turned to leave, a small figure appeared in the doorway behind Mrs. Holloway. Catherine stood there, dressed in a faded blue dress that Elijah recognized with a painful jolt. It had been Emma's favorite, worn on special occasions and carefully preserved these 8 years in a cedar chest. On Catherine, it was slightly short at the ankles, but otherwise fit well enough. Her face was still pale, eyes shadowed with the nightmares Elijah had heard her crying out against in the pre-dawn hours. But there was a new alertness in her gaze, as it moved from Elijah to Reed and back again. Reed, remembering her reaction to him yesterday, took a step back and touched the brim of his hat. "Miss," he said, his usually gruff voice gentle, "good to see you up and about." Catherine didn't respond, but she didn't shrink away from him either. Instead, she moved slowly onto the porch, her bare feet silent on the wooden planks as she approached the railing to look out over the ranch. Her expression remained unreadable as she surveyed the same scene Elijah had been assessing moments before. "I've got breakfast waiting," Mrs. Holloway said, placing a protective hand near, but not touching, Catherine's shoulder. "Flapjacks and bacon. You need to eat to keep up your strength." Catherine turned to look up at Elijah, that same disconcerting directness in her gaze. It was as if she were waiting for his lead, his permission. "Go on," he said gruffly. "Do as Mrs. Holloway says." After a moment's hesitation, Catherine nodded and followed the housekeeper inside. At the door, she paused to look back at Elijah, a question in her eyes that he couldn't or wouldn't interpret. "Strange one, isn't she?" Reed observed once she was gone. "Sheriff says she hasn't spoken a word since they found her. Doc Winters thinks it might be permanent, shock affecting her mind." "Not our problem," Elijah replied, though the words lacked his usual conviction. "Let's worry about the cattle before Jackson uses this as an excuse to push his boundary claims again." For the next several hours, Elijah lost himself in the physical demands of rounding up scattered cattle. The work was exhausting and dangerous, especially with the ground turned to treacherous mud by the storm, but it was blessedly straightforward, unlike the complication waiting for him back at the ranch house. It was mid-afternoon when Elijah and Reed finally turned their horses toward home, the herd secured once more in the north pasture. As they crested the hill overlooking the main ranch buildings, Elijah pulled up short. A wagon was parked in front of the house. Not the sheriff's usual conveyance, but the larger covered wagon belonging to James Miller, Pine Creek's general store owner. And standing on the porch, engaged in animated conversation with Mrs. Holloway, was Abigail Miller, James's wife, and the town's most notorious gossip. "That's all we need," Elijah muttered. "The whole territory will know about our guest by sundown." Reed chuckled. "Probably already does. Nothing travels faster than news carried by Abigail Miller." Elijah considered steering toward the stables, avoiding the house entirely until the unwelcome visitor departed. But as he watched, Catherine appeared in the doorway. Even from a distance, her discomfort was evident in the rigid set of her shoulders, and the way she half hid behind Mrs. Holloway. Abigail Miller was reaching toward the girl, her mouth moving rapidly in what Elijah knew would be a torrent of questions and false sympathy. Catherine was backing away, her face turned from the stranger's invasive curiosity. "Damn it!" Elijah growled, spurring his horse down the hill. Reed followed close behind. By the time they reached the house, Catherine had retreated inside, but Abigail Miller's voice carried clearly across the yard. "The poor lamb! And to think she witnessed such savagery. James says the army found 17 bodies, all scalped and mutilated. They're saying it was Blackfoot, but you know how these things get blamed on Indians when it's just as likely white. Outlaws dressed up to look like, oh, Mr. Blackwood." She broke off as Elijah dismounted, handing his reins to Reed with a significant look. The foreman nodded, understanding his boss's desire for him to take the horses and make himself scarce. "Mrs. Miller," Elijah said, removing his hat with cold courtesy, "this is an unexpected visit." Abigail, a plump woman of 40, with elaborately curled hair and a dress whose bright patterns defied the frontier's usual practicality, smiled broadly. "Sheriff Thompson mentioned you'd taken in that poor orphan girl. I was delivering supplies to the Hendersons. Their roof got torn clean. Off in the storm, can you imagine? And thought I'd bring some things for the child. Growing girls need proper clothes, and I had Catherine's old dresses packed away. Such a blessing they can be put to use." "Catherine," Mrs. Holloway corrected. "The girl's name is Catherine." "Oh, of course. Catherine, that's right, such a pretty name. Does she talk yet? Sheriff said she was struck dumb by the horror of it all. My second cousin's boy was the same way after he saw his dog get trampled by a runaway wagon. Didn't speak for a month, then woke up one morning singing hymns like a canary. Strangest thing." Elijah stepped onto the porch, deliberately placing himself between Abigail and the door. "We appreciate your thoughtfulness, Mrs. Miller, but the girl is resting now. The army will be sending someone for her soon." "Oh, but surely you're not sending her to those rough soldiers." Abigail's eyes widened with theatrical horror. A delicate child who suffered such trauma needs a woman's care. Now, Reverend Phillips and his wife have their hands full with those influenza orphans, but my James and I were just saying at breakfast how our house has been too quiet since our Catherine married and moved to Helena. A calculated pause, then, of course, a man's home is so empty without the sound of children. I'm sure you understand that better than most, Mr. Blackwood. The deliberate reference to his lost family sent a surge of cold anger through Elijah. Mrs. Holloway made a small sound of disapproval, but before either could respond, a soft scuffing noise drew their attention. Catherine stood in the doorway, again watching the exchange with those two perceptive eyes. She had pulled her hair back with a ribbon, one of Emma's, Elijah realized, with another unwelcome pang, and there was high color in her cheeks that hadn't been there before. Abigail immediately pushed past Elijah, her voice rising to a cloying sweetness. "There you are, you poor dear creature. I'm Mrs. Miller from Pine Creek. I've brought you some lovely dresses that used to belong to my daughter. She's grown and married now, living in Helena with 2 little ones of her own. I was just telling Mr. Blackwood that my husband and I would be delighted to give you a proper home until your relatives can be located." She reached for Catherine's hand, but the girl quickly stepped backward, bumping into the doorframe in her haste to avoid the contact. "She doesn't care about being touched," Mrs. Holloway explained, moving to stand beside Catherine. "The doctor says it's common in cases of severe shock." "Poor little lamb," Abigail crooned, undeterred. "You'll feel better once you're settled. In a proper family home. A child needs a mother's love, especially after such a terrible ordeal." Catherine's eyes darted to Elijah, that same question visible in them, a question he still couldn't decipher. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his patience wearing dangerously thin, "while we appreciate your concern, decisions about the girl's welfare will be made by the proper authorities. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to attend to." The storm did considerable damage. Abigail drew herself up, affronted by his dismissal. "Well, I was only trying to help. It's what any Christian woman would do." She glanced meaningfully at Mrs. Holloway. "I'll leave the dresses. They're in the wagon. James can bring them up. No need to trouble your husband," Mrs. Holloway replied smoothly. "I'm sure Samuel or one of the other hands can fetch them before you leave." It was a clear dismissal, and Abigail had no choice but to accept it. With a final, pitying look at Catherine, she made her way down the porch steps, her skirts swishing with indignation. "I'll be praying for the child," she called back, "and for you, Mr. Blackwood. The Lord knows how difficult it must be, having a young girl in your house again after everything." Elijah's hand tightened on the porch railing, his knuckles white with the effort of restraining his temper. Mrs. Holloway made a small, disapproving noise, but said nothing until Abigail had climbed back into her wagon and signaled her husband to drive away. "That woman," she muttered, "has all the tact of a stampeding buffalo." To everyone's surprise, a small sound came from Catherine. Not quite a laugh, but something close to it. It was the first voluntary noise she had made since arriving at Blackwood Ranch. Mrs. Holloway and Elijah both turned to look at her. The ghost of a smile touched the girl's lips before disappearing, but for that brief moment, she had seemed like any normal child, amused by an adult's comment. "Well," Mrs. Holloway said, clearly pleased, "at least someone appreciates my observations. Come along, Catherine. Let's see what's worth salvaging from Mrs. Miller's offerings. The woman has dreadful taste in fabric, but beggars can't be choosers." As they turned to go inside, Elijah found himself oddly reluctant to return to work. Something about the girl's almost smile had stirred a forgotten feeling in him, a protectiveness he had thought burned away years ago. "Mr. Blackwood," Mrs. Holloway paused at the door. "Will you be joining us for supper at the usual time?" The question was ordinary, one she asked every day, but today it carried an undercurrent of meaning. Would he join them at the table, or would he take his meal in his study, as he had done so often in the years since losing his family? Elijah looked at Catherine, standing silently beside his housekeeper. The girl met his gaze steadily, and in her eyes he saw not just a question, but challenge. "Yes," he said finally. "The usual time." Later that evening, after a silent but oddly companionable supper, Elijah sat in his study reviewing the ranch accounts. The work was tedious but necessary, especially with the additional expenses the storm damage would incur. He was deep in concentration when a soft knock at the door interrupted him. He looked up to find Catherine standing in the doorway, a book clutched in her hands, the same story he had read to her during the storm. Her hair had been neatly braided for sleep, and she wore a clean nightgown, but her eyes were alert, showing no signs of drowsiness. "It's late," Elijah said, setting aside his ledger. "You should be in bed." Catherine took a step into the room, then held out the book with a questioning look. Elijah hesitated. Last night had been different, an emergency, a distraction from the storm. Reading to her again would suggest a routine, an arrangement more permanent than he was prepared to offer. "Mrs. Holloway can read to you," he said, turning back to his accounts. "She's better at it than I am." He expected the girl to leave, perhaps disappointed but accepting his rejection. Instead, she crossed the room with quiet determination and placed the book directly on top of his ledger, forcing him to acknowledge it. When he looked up in surprise, Catherine's expression was resolute. She pointed at him, then at the book, her meaning unmistakable. "You're a stubborn one, aren't you?" Elijah observed a reluctant note of admiration in his voice. Catherine nodded solemnly, then pointed again at the book. Elijah sighed, relenting. One chapter, then bed. A hint of triumph flickered in her eyes as she settled into the chair opposite his desk, tucking her feet up beneath her and watching him expectantly. As Elijah opened the book to where they had left off, he found himself wondering what her voice sounded like. This silent, determined child who communicated more clearly without words than many adults did with them. "The crystal lobster," he began reading, had grown larger overnight, its claws now spanning the width of our table. From the hallway, unseen by either Elijah or Catherine, Mrs. Holloway observed the scene with quiet satisfaction. There was a long road ahead for both of them, the grieving man and the traumatized child. But tonight, at least, a small bridge had been built across the chasm of their separate losses. The following morning brought clear skies and the distant sound of hammering as the ranch hands set about repairing storm damage. Elijah was in the stables, discussing breeding plans with Reed, when Samuel Jenkins burst in, out of breath and wide-eyed. "Mr. Blackwood, riders coming. Looks like army patrol. 6 men moving fast." Elijah handed the breeding records back to Reed. "Probably about the girl. Let Mrs. Holloway know." By the time he reached the main yard, the soldiers were dismounting. 5 enlisted men led by a young lieutenant Elijah didn't recognize. Their uniforms were travel-stained, their expressions grave. "Lieutenant Harker, 5th Cavalry," the officer introduced himself with a crisp salute. "Are you Elijah Blackwood?" Catherine's eyes locked with Elijah's, and the fear in them was so raw, so immediate, that he found himself saying, "Go to the kitchen, both of you. Stay there until I come for you." In his study, Lieutenant Harker removed his hat and stood at attention, formal despite his obvious fatigue. "Sir, I need to confirm the girl you're sheltering was found hidden in a false compartment beneath a wagon floor. That's my understanding. Sheriff Thompson brought her here 2 days ago." Harker nodded grimly. "Then I need to inform you of a developing situation. The attack on that wagon train wasn't a random act of violence. Our scouts found evidence it was specifically targeted." Elijah frowned. "Targeted? By whom?" "We're not certain yet, but there's evidence that whoever did it was looking for something, or someone." Harker's gaze was steady. "Every wagon was searched methodically before being burned. Bodies were arranged in a way that suggests they were questioned before being killed. What does this have to do with Catherine?" "Catherine?" Harker looked confused. "Is that what she told you her name was?" "She hasn't spoken since she was found. We believe her name is Catherine Parker, based on a journal recovered from the wagon where she was hidden." Harker shook his head slowly. "Sir, that's just it. According to our investigation, there was no Catherine Parker traveling with that wagon train. The journal belonged to Mary Parker, yes, but she and her husband were a childless couple from Pennsylvania, not Ohio. They were traveling with his elderly father. No daughter." Elijah stared at the lieutenant, trying to process this information. "Then who is she?" "That's what we need to find out, and why someone might be still hunting for her still." Harker straightened his shoulders. "I have orders to bring her to Fort Wallace for her protection while we investigate. Colonel's orders." A surge of unexpected protectiveness rose in Elijah. "She's traumatized, Lieutenant. Hasn't spoken, barely eats. Moving her now could do more harm than good." "With respect, sir, leaving her here could be dangerous. For her and for you. Whoever attacked that wagon train left no survivors for a reason. If they learn she escaped..." The implication hung in the air between them. Elijah thought of Catherine's fearful eyes when she saw the uniform, of the way she had almost smiled at Mrs. Holloway's comment, of how she had stood her ground last night demanding he read to her. "Give me 3 days," he said finally. "She's just starting to feel safe here. I'll try to get her to communicate what she knows. If she's in danger, we need to understand why before we traumatize her further." Harker considered this, clearly, torn between his orders and the logic of Elijah's request. 3 days, he agreed reluctantly. "But I'll need to leave 2 of my men here as guards, and if there's any sign of trouble, we move her immediately." Elijah nodded, sealing the agreement. But as he showed the lieutenant out, he couldn't shake the feeling that Catherine, or whatever her real name was, had brought more than just her silent grief to Blackwood Ranch. She had brought danger as well, reaching out from a past as mysterious as his own was painful. She's not Catherine Parker. Elijah's words hung in the kitchen air, heavy as anvils. Mrs. Holloway set down the pot she'd been scrubbing, her usual composure slipping for just a moment. What do you mean? The journal belonged to a childless couple. Elijah glanced toward the parlor where Catherine, or whoever she was, sat with one of the army privates, a young soldier named Davis, who had shown a gentle way with children. The other soldier, Corporal Wilson, stood watch outside. The army believes the attack wasn't random. The wagons were searched methodically before they were burned. Mrs. Holloway wiped her hands on her apron, brow furrowed in concern. Then who is she? And why was she hiding? Elijah had been asking himself the same question since Lieutenant Harker's departure an hour earlier. The girl had refused to make eye contact with him since seeing the soldiers retreating back into the shell of silence and fear she'd begun to emerge from. I don't know. But we have 3 days to find out before they take her to Fort Wallace. He hesitated, then added, Harker thinks whoever did this might come looking for her. The housekeeper's eyes widened. Here, to the ranch? It's possible. That's why he left the guards. Elijah moved to the window, scanning the property with new wariness. The familiar landscape of barns, corrals, and open pasture suddenly seemed vulnerable, exposed. We need to know what she's running from, who might be after her. That poor child. Mrs. Holloway shook her head. How do we get her to tell us anything when she won't or can't speak? Elijah watched as Private Davis showed Catherine a small wooden horse he'd carved. The girl examined it with polite interest, but her posture remained tense, her eyes darting periodically toward the kitchen where she knew Elijah and Mrs. Holloway were talking. She trusts you, Mrs. Holloway observed, following his gaze, more than anyone else. She doesn't know me, Elijah countered, uncomfortable with the idea. Children have instincts about people, and this one's sharper than most. The housekeeper gave him a knowing look. Perhaps it's time you told her your story, might encourage her to share hers. Elijah stiffened. My past isn't relevant, isn't it? A man who lost his family to violence, and a child who survived the same. Mrs. Holloway's voice was gentle. Shared pain builds bridges, Mr. Blackwood, and that girl needs a bridge right now more than anything. Before Elijah could respond, Thomas Reed appeared at the back door, his expression urgent. Mr. Blackwood, riders coming up from the south. Trail! 3 men, moving fast! Elijah felt a cold prickle of alertness. Army? No, sir, not in uniform. Look like civilians, but they're armed. Elijah moved quickly, grabbing his rifle from the rack by the door. Get Catherine upstairs. Tell Wilson to position himself at the front. Davis stays with the girl. Mrs. Holloway didn't question the orders, immediately heading to the parlor. Elijah watched as she spoke quietly to the soldier and Catherine, leading them toward the stairs. The girl glanced back at Elijah. Fear and something else. Resignation. Perhaps in her eyes. Reed, get Samuel and Matthews. Have them ready but out of sight in the barn. Elijah checked his rifle, then his sidearm. Let's see what our visitors want before we show our full hand. By the time the 3 riders reached the main yard, Elijah stood on the porch, rifle held casually but visibly. Corporal Wilson had positioned himself at the corner of the house, his own weapon at the ready. The lead rider was a tall man, with a carefully groomed beard and expensive clothes that had seen hard travel. His companions were rougher types, one wiry with a pockmarked face, the other broad-shouldered with a scar running from his temple to jaw. Good afternoon, the leader called, reining in his horse a respectful distance away. I'm looking for Elijah Blackwood. You found him, Elijah replied, not moving from his position. What's your business here? The man dismounted with the easy grace of someone accustomed to authority. My name is Harrison Walsh. I represent the Western Union Railroad Company. He reached slowly into his coat, noting Elijah's watchful gaze, and withdrew a leather folio. I have credentials, if you'd care to examine them. Elijah nodded for Wilson to retrieve the documents. The corporal did so, then handed them to Elijah without taking his eyes off the other two men, who remained mounted. The papers appeared legitimate. Official letterhead, company seal, signatures of railroad executives Elijah had read about in newspapers. Walsh was identified as a special investigator for the company. What does the railroad want with my ranch, Mr. Walsh? Elijah asked, handing the papers back to Wilson. Walsh smiled, showing perfect teeth that seemed incongruous with his trail-worn appearance. Not your ranch, Mr. Blackwood. Information. We're tracking a fugitive, a young girl who witnessed something she shouldn't have and disappeared with documents that belonged to the company. Elijah kept his expression neutral despite the jolt of confirmation. What kind of documents? Company ledgers, financial records, nothing that would mean anything to most people, but in the wrong hands. Walsh shrugged elegantly. Corporate espionage is a serious matter. And what does this have to do with me? Walsh's eyes hardened slightly, despite his maintained smile. We have reason to believe the girl was traveling with a wagon train that met with tragedy near here. The army has been most helpful in their investigation, but they mentioned a survivor had been brought to your ranch, a young girl. Elijah noted how Walsh skirted around directly mentioning the massacre. News travels fast. It's my job to stay. Informed, Walsh replied smoothly. Is she here, Mr. Blackwood? The girl from the wagon train? Elijah considered his options. Denying Catherine's presence when the army patrol was clearly visible would be pointless. But something about Walsh raised his hackles. The too-perfect smile, the careful way he avoided specifics about the tragedy. A girl was brought here, yes, he said finally. Traumatized. Hasn't spoken a word. Sheriff Thompson is arranging more suitable accommodation in town. Walsh's companions exchanged glances. I'd like to see her, if I may, Walsh said, to confirm whether she's the one we're seeking. If so, the railroad would be most grateful for her safe return. There's a substantial reward. She's resting now, Elijah replied. Doctor's orders, and frankly, Mr. Walsh, I find it odd that the railroad would send 3 armed men to track down one frightened girl. Walsh's smile didn't waver, but his eyes grew colder. Corporate matters can be complex, Mr. Blackwood, and the Montana Territory is not known for its safety. He gestured to his companions. Mr. Delaney and Mr. Kurtz are my security detail. The scarred man, presumably either Delaney or Kurtz, shifted in his saddle, his coat falling open to reveal a holstered revolver. It wasn't the weapon that caught Elijah's attention, though, but the distinctive silver and turquoise band on the man's wrist, Navajo craftsmanship and expensive. A memory surfaced. Emma admiring a similar bracelet at a trading post years ago. Sarah buying it for her birthday, the way his daughter's face had lit up as she slipped it on her small wrist. We can come back tomorrow, if that's more convenient, Walsh continued, interpreting Elijah's silence as hesitation. Though time is of some essence in this matter, Elijah made his decision. Tomorrow will be better. The girl should have recovered enough for visitors by then. He deliberately avoided using any name for her. Walsh nodded, apparently satisfied. Until tomorrow, then. What time would be suitable? Noon, Elijah said. We'll expect you for dinner after. The riders departed. Elijah remained on the porch until they disappeared from view. Wilson approached, his young face serious. Sir, didn't the lieutenant say not to let anyone know about the girl? He did. Elijah continued staring down the road. Go find Reed. Tell him to send our fastest rider to Fort Wallace with a message for Lieutenant Harker. Tell him our railroad investigators have arrived. Inside, Elijah found Mrs. Holloway descending the stairs. "She's with Private Davis in the guest room," the housekeeper reported. "Who were those men?" "They claimed to be from the railroad, looking for a girl who stole company documents." Elijah moved to the gun cabinet, selecting additional ammunition. But the one with the scar was wearing Navajo silver. Mrs. Holloway's face paled. "Like the bracelet you bought Emma." "Similar." Elijah loaded cartridges into his belt with mechanical precision. Common enough jewelry in some parts, but not typical for railroad security. "You think they're connected to the attack?" "I think we need answers, and quickly." Elijah secured the gun cabinet. "I'm going to talk to the girl." Catherine sat on the window seat in the guest room, watching the departing riders with the intensity of a hawk tracking prey. Private Davis stood nearby, his carbine held ready, but his manner gentle as he tried to engage her in conversation. "She sure doesn't miss much, sir," the young soldier told Elijah as he entered. "Been watching those fellows like she could burn holes through 'em with her eyes." Elijah approached the window, standing beside Catherine. "You recognize them, don't you?" The girl's head snapped up, her gaze meeting his for the first time since the soldier's arrival. The fear in her eyes was answered enough. "Davis, give us a moment," Elijah said. "Wait outside the door." When they were alone, Elijah pulled a chair close to the window seat, sitting so he was at eye level with Catherine. "Those men are looking for you. They'll be back tomorrow, and I need to know what I'm dealing with." Catherine's expression closed, her small hands clenching in her lap. "You don't have to speak," Elijah continued, softening his tone. "But I need to understand what's happening. Mrs. Holloway thinks you might open up if I—" He hesitated, the words sticking in his throat. "If I share my story first." The girl tilted her head slightly, curiosity breaking through her fear. Elijah took a deep breath, forcing himself to continue. 8 years ago, this ranch was different, louder, happier. He looked past Catherine to the mountains beyond, seeing not the present landscape but the ghosts of his past. "My wife, Sarah, loves music. Always humming, singing, drove me half crazy. Sometimes a ghost of a smile touched his lips, then vanished. Our daughter Emma was 10, smart as a whip, loved books, horses, and turning my orderly life upside down." Catherine's gaze remained fixed on him, absorbing every word. "I was away when it happened, in Helena, testifying against cattle rustlers we'd caught on our land." The familiar pain rose in his chest, but he pushed through it. A group of men came, 7 of them. Former soldiers turned outlaws, calling themselves the Blackwell Gang. Their leader had a distinctive piece of jewelry, a Navajo silver and turquoise bracelet. Catherine's eyes widened, her breathing quickening. They'd been raiding isolated homesteads, but our ranch was their biggest target. They killed 2 ranch hands, took what valuables they could find, and then— Elijah's voice roughened. "They found Sarah and Emma trying to escape through the year back. The hands who survived told me Sarah fought like a wildcat, giving Emma a chance to run, but she didn't make it far enough." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the distant sounds of ranch work outside. "I wasn't here to protect them," Elijah continued, the admission like broken glass in his throat. "By the time I got back, the army had found their bodies in the creek bed. They'd been running for the neighbor's place." His hands tightened on his knees. "I tracked the Blackwell Gang for 2 years after that, found 5 of them. Made sure they faced justice. Justice was a mild word for what had happened to those men, but Catherine didn't need those details. 2 got away. The leader, James Blackwell, and his brother Robert. Last I heard, they'd moved their operations to California." Elijah refocused on Catherine's face. "But that bracelet today, it was identical to the one Blackwell wore. Too distinctive to be coincidence." Understanding dawned in the girl's eyes, followed by a new, sharper fear. She glanced toward the door, then back at Elijah, her meaning clear. "They need to leave." "First, I need to know who you are," Elijah insisted gently, "and what they want from you." If those men are connected to the Blackwell gang, they're dangerous in ways you might not understand." Catherine bit her lip, indecision plain on her face. Then with sudden resolve, she slid off the window seat and went to the small traveling bag Mrs. Holloway had provided for her few possessions. From its depths, she withdrew a folded packet of papers, which she thrust toward Elijah with trembling hands. He took them carefully. The outer page was a letter addressed to "My dearest brother Frederick" and signed "Your loving sister Rebecca." The date, April 2nd, 1876, was less than 3 weeks ago. "Is this your mother?" Elijah asked. "Rebecca." Catherine shook her head, then pointed to the signature, then to herself. "You're Rebecca," Elijah clarified, surprised. "This is your handwriting." The girl nodded, then motioned for him to continue reading. The letter described concerns about financial improprieties discovered at the western office of the railroad, where Rebecca apparently worked as a secretary. Phrases like "falsified land," claims missing funds, and "threatened me when I asked questions" jumped out from the careful handwriting. Behind the letter were documents, ledger entries showing large sums moving between accounts, land deeds with altered boundaries, and a list of names with amounts beside them. Even to Elijah's untrained eye, it looked like evidence of significant fraud. "You took these from the railroad office," he said, understanding Dawn. "That's why they're hunting you." Catherine Rebecca nodded solemnly. "And the Parkers? The people from the wagon train?" Rebecca made a writing motion with her hand. Elijah found paper and pencil in the small desk near the window and gave them to her. Her handwriting was neat, despite her shaking hands. "Mary and James Parker were taking me to my brother in Helena. They told everyone I was their daughter, Catherine. For safety, Mr. Parker worked for the railroad. He helped me escape with the evidence after Mr. Walsh threatened me." The pieces fell into place in Elijah's mind. "Walsh discovered Parker was helping you. He sent men after the wagon train, men connected to the Blackwell gang." His jaw tightened with renewed anger. "They murdered an entire wagon train to silence you and recover those documents." Rebecca wrote again, "I didn't know they would kill everyone. It's my fault." "No," Elijah said firmly. "Men like Walsh and Blackwell make their own choices. The blood is on their hands, not yours." He carefully refolded the documents. "But this explains why they're so determined to find you. With these papers, they could all hang for fraud, let alone murder." A knock at the door interrupted them. Private Davis poked his head in. "Sir, Mrs. Holloway says supper's ready, and Corporal Wilson wants a word when you have a moment." "Tell him I'll be right down." Elijah turned back to Rebecca. "We need to get you and these papers to safety. Your brother in Helena might still be in danger if they know about him." Rebecca's face crumpled at this suggestion, and she grabbed the pencil again. "Frederick is dead, killed in a robbery 2 days before I fled with the documents. That's why the Parkers were taking me to Helena, to meet with a federal marshal who was investigating the railroad." Elijah felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. These men were methodical, eliminating everyone connected to their schemes. The fact that they'd tracked Rebecca to his ranch meant they had resources and information beyond what ordinary outlaws could manage. "We'll figure this out," he promised, though the path forward was far from clear. "For now, stay in this room. Davis will remain with you. I'll have Mrs. Holloway bring your supper up." Rebecca caught his arm as he rose to leave, her expression pleading. She scribbled one more note. "They'll hurt you and everyone here to get to me. I should go with them tomorrow." "That's not happening," Elijah said, his voice hardening with resolve. "I've spent 8 years hiding from the world, Rebecca. Maybe it's time I remembered how to fight back." Downstairs, Elijah found Corporal Wilson waiting in the study, his young face grave. "Sir, I sent Matthews to Fort Wallace with your message, but there's something else you should know." The soldier lowered his voice. "When those men rode up, I recognized the one with the scar. He was at Fort Wallace last week, talking with Lieutenant Brooks, who's been under investigation for taking bribes. Elijah processed this new information grimly, so they may have friends at the fort. It's possible, sir. Can't say for certain, but... Wilson straightened his shoulders. Private Davis and I won't let anyone take that girl unless we have direct orders from Lieutenant Harker or Colonel Westfield. Thank you, Corporal. Elijah moved to his desk, pulling out a map of the territory. Now I need to figure out how to get Rebecca and those documents to safety before noon tomorrow. As night fell over Blackwood Ranch, Elijah gathered his most trusted people in the kitchen, Mrs. Holloway, Thomas Reed, and the two soldiers. Rebecca sat at the table with them, her small figure dwarfed by the adults, but her eyes alert and determined. Walsh and his men will return at noon, Elijah explained, pointing to positions on the ranch map. They believe they're dining with us to discuss Rebecca. Instead, Reed will be taking her and the documents north through Carson Pass. That's a mighty rough country, boss, Reed observed, especially for a young girl. It's also the last direction they'd expect, Elijah countered. The obvious route to Helena is east, but they'll be watching that. North through the pass, then east along the river will take longer, but offer better cover. Rebecca pushed forward a note she'd written. I can ride and climb. I'm stronger than I look, Elijah nodded, acknowledging her determination. Mrs. Holloway will prepare supplies. Davis, you'll accompany them. And what will you and Wilson be doing, sir? The private asked. Buying time, Elijah replied. Grimly, convincing Walsh that Rebecca is still too traumatized to see visitors. If we're lucky, Matthews will return with reinforcements from Fort Wallace before they realize she's gone. And if you're not lucky, Mrs. Holloway asked, voicing what everyone was thinking. Elijah's hand rested on his holstered revolver. Then Wilson and I will handle it. Dawn had barely broken when Elijah stood in the barn, checking the provisions packed onto the sturdy mountain pony Rebecca would ride. Thomas Reed worked silently beside him, securing bedrolls and canteens to his own mount. Enough food for 5 or days, Elijah muttered, more to himself than Reed. Ammunition, medical supplies, blankets for the mountain cold. We're well prepared, boss, Reed assured him, his weathered face solemn in the lantern light. I've made that trip through Carson, past a dozen times. Know every cave and shelter along the way. Elijah nodded, then handed Reed a heavy envelope. $500. If you get separated from Davis, or if there's trouble at Fort Collins, this will get you and the girl passage on the eastbound train. My brother-in-law in Chicago will help you from there. Reed tucked the envelope into his inner coat pocket. Without comment, both men understood the gravity of the situation when Elijah Blackwood, known for his careful management of every dollar, handed over such a sum without hesitation. One more thing, Elijah said, reaching back into his coat. He withdrew a folded paper and passed it to Reed. Deed to the North Pasture, 300 acres, signed over to you. In case I'm not... You keep that, Reed interrupted, pushing the paper back. I'll be returning with the girl safe, and you'll be here waiting. Then we can discuss pasture rights over a bottle of that whiskey you think I don't know about in your desk drawer. A ghost of a smile touched Elijah's lips. Fair. Enough. The barn door creaked open, admitting Mrs. Holloway and Rebecca. The girl wore boys' clothing, trousers, sturdy boots, and a wool coat that had once belonged to a young ranch hand. Her hair had been tucked up under a wide-brimmed hat, and from a distance she could easily pass for a slender youth of 12 or 13. She insisted on this, Mrs. Holloway explained, gesturing to the disguise, wrote out that she'd be less noticeable as a boy. Smart thinking, if you ask me. Rebecca carried a small satchel clutched tightly to her chest, the documents that had cost so many lives already. Her face was pale but determined, the shock that had rendered her silent gradually giving way to a resilient focus Elijah recognized all too well. Good thinking, he agreed, kneeling to check that Rebecca's boots were properly laced for riding. The less attention you draw, the better. Rebecca handed him a folded note. Elijah opened it, reading her neat handwriting. Thank you for risking everything for a stranger. I won't forget this. You're not a stranger anymore, Elijah replied simply. The truth of that statement surprised him. In just a few days, this silent, stubborn girl had somehow breached the walls he'd spent 8 years building around his heart. Private Davis entered the barn, his rifle slung over his shoulder, and his young face serious. Perimeter check complete. Sir, no sign of anyone watching the ranch. Corporal Wilson has positioned himself in the north tower with clear sightlines to all approaches. Good. Elijah turned to Rebecca. Davis and Reed will keep you safe. Follow their instructions without question. When you reach Fort Collins, ask for Marshal Donovan. Show him the documents and tell him everything. He was a friend of my wife's brother. He'll help you. Rebecca nodded solemnly, then did something unexpected. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Elijah's waist in a fierce hug. For a moment he stood frozen, unused to such contact after years of isolation. Then awkwardly he placed a hand on her shoulder in what he hoped was a reassuring gesture. Go on now, he said gruffly, stepping back. You need to be well into the pass before Walsh and his men arrive. Reed helped Rebecca mount her pony, adjusting the stirrups to her shorter legs. Davis swung into his own saddle, checking his weapons one last time. We'll take the north trail through the pines, Reed explained. Stays under cover most of the way. If all goes well, we'll hit the pass by nightfall. Elijah nodded. I'll hold Walsh here as long as possible. With luck, Matthews will return with Harker's men before they realize the girl is gone. Mrs. Holloway stepped forward, pressing a small package into Rebecca's hands. Cornbread and honey. For when the trail gets hard. The girl's eyes glistened with tears as she tucked the gift into her coat pocket. Then with a final nod to Elijah, she turned her pony toward the barn's rear door, which opened onto a trail leading directly into the forest that bordered the northern edge of Blackwood Ranch. As the small party disappeared into the pre-dawn, shadows, Mrs. Holloway sighed. Do you think they'll make it? Reed knows those mountains better than any man alive, Elijah replied, though his eyes remained fixed on the tree line long after the riders had vanished. And Davis is a good soldier. They have a solid chance. And what about us? The housekeeper asked, studying his face. What are our chances when Walsh discovers the girl is gone? Elijah turned toward the ranch house, his expression hardening into the cold mask he'd worn for 8 years. Let's make breakfast, Mrs. Holloway. We're having company for lunch. By mid-morning, Elijah had positioned the remaining ranch hands strategically around the property. Samuel Jenkins and 2 others were stationed in the barn with rifles, appearing to be engaged in ordinary repairs. Young Matthews had not yet returned from Fort Wallace, which could mean either trouble or simply delays on the storm-damaged roads. Corporal Wilson remained in the watchtower, which offered views of all approaches to the main house. Elijah himself moved between the house and outbuildings, maintaining the appearance of a normal day's activities while keeping sightlines clear to all vulnerable points. Bread's just about done, Mrs. Holloway announced as Elijah entered the kitchen. The table was set for company, their best dishes and silver laid out as if Walsh and his men were welcome guests rather than threats. Venison stew been simmering since dawn. Those men will have no cause to complain about Blackwood hospitality. Elijah raised an eyebrow at her unusual attention to such details. Mrs. Holloway's cooking was always excellent, but rarely elaborate. Reading. His expression, she shrugged. The longer they sit eating, the more time Reed and the girl have to get away. Besides, she added with a hint of steel beneath her practical tone, best they don't suspect anything until they're good and settled. You're a formidable woman, Mrs. Holloway, Elijah observed, not for the first time. 8 years managing this household required nothing less, Mr. Blackwood. She checked the oven again, then straightened, her face growing serious. There's something I've been meaning to tell you. With everything happening, it seemed the right time. Elijah waited, sensing her hesitation. When I came to work here after Sarah and Emma... She paused, then continued with renewed resolve. I'd lost my own family too. Husband to influenza, son to the war. I understood your silence, your need for order. I respected it. She met his eyes directly. But seeing you with that girl these past days, it's the first time you've seemed alive since I've known you. Whatever happens today, I want you to know I think Sarah would be proud of the man you're becoming again. Before Elijah could respond to this unexpected declaration, Wilson's sharp whistle pierced the air, the signal they'd arranged to indicate approaching riders. The moment the connection broke, Elijah checked his sidearm and moved to the window. At 3. Riders, he confirmed, watching dust rise on the approaching road. Right on time. Mrs. Holloway nodded briskly, all business once more. I'll finish the preparations. You greet our guests. Harrison Walsh and his companions arrived precisely. At noon, as promised, they dismounted with the casual confidence of men unaware they were being watched through rifle sights from the barn and tower. Mr. Blackwood, Walsh called, removing his hat as Elijah appeared on the porch. As agreed. I hope we find you well? Well, enough, Elijah replied evenly. Mrs. Holloway has prepared dinner. You can wash up at the pump if you like. The scarred man, Kurtz, Elijah had learned from Rebecca's notes, scanned the property with professional assessment. His hand never strayed far from his holstered revolver, and his eyes lingered on the watchtower where Wilson remained carefully. Concealed. Quite an operation you have here, Walsh observed as they moved toward the house. I understand Blackwood Ranch is one of the most successful in the territory. We manage, Elijah said, deliberately modest. The land is good to those who respect it. Inside, Mrs. Holloway had transformed the dining room into a picture of frontier elegance. Fresh wildflowers from her garden adorned the center of the table, and the aroma of freshly baked bread and rich stew filled the air. She greeted the visitors with cool politeness, directing them to their seats with the authority of a general positioning troops. The girl will be joining us? Walsh inquired. His tone casual, though his eyes were sharp as he scanned the room. She's resting, Elijah replied, taking his seat at the head of the table. Doctors still concerned about her condition. Shock affects children deeply. Walsh's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course. Perhaps after we eat, then. Perhaps. Elijah agreed, non-committally. Depends on how she's feeling. Throughout the meal, conversation remained superficial. Discussion of ranch operations, the recent storm damage, Walsh's alleged railroad business. The scarred Kurtz ate silently, his vigilant gaze never settling in one place for long. The third man, Delaney, spoke only when addressed directly, his manner suggesting a hired gun rather than a genuine railroad employee. As Mrs. Holloway served coffee and apple pie, Walsh finally steered the conversation toward their true purpose. Mr. Blackwood, I don't wish to impose on your hospitality much longer. My employers are quite anxious to resolve this situation with the missing documents. He set down his fork, all pretense of casual dining abandoned. I really must insist on seeing the girl now. Elijah sipped his coffee, deliberately unhurried. What exactly were these documents? You mentioned ledgers? Company financial records, Walsh replied smoothly. Internal matters that would be of no interest to anyone but our accountants. Important enough to send 3 armed men to retrieve them, Elijah observed. Walsh's smile didn't reach his eyes. As I explained, the territories can be dangerous. Corporate espionage is a serious concern for an enterprise as large as Western Union Railroad. Serious enough to warrant killing an entire wagon train? The words hung in the suddenly silent room. Even Mrs. Holloway, who had been clearing dishes, froze at the directness of Elijah's accusation. Walsh's expression didn't change, but something cold and calculating entered his gaze. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Mr. Blackwood. The wagon train was attacked by Indians, as I understand it. A terrible tragedy." "Curious thing about Indian attacks," Elijah continued, setting down his cup with deliberate precision. "They don't typically search wagons methodically before burning them. They don't question victims before killing them, and they certainly don't wear Navajo silver bracelets stolen from murdered ranchers' families 8 years ago." The scarred man, Kurtz, stiffened, his hand dropping below the table. Elijah had no doubt it now rested on a concealed weapon. "Mr. Blackwood," Walsh said, all pretense of cordiality vanishing, "I came here in good faith to retrieve company, property, and a witness in a corporate matter. If you're implying something more sinister, I suggest you consider your position carefully. You're one man on an isolated ranch." "Am I?" Elijah asked mildly. As if on cue, a rifle shot cracked the air outside. Wilson signaled that Matthews had returned, hopefully with reinforcements from Fort Wallace. The diversion was perfectly timed, causing all 3 visitors to tense, hands moving to weapons. Walsh recovered first, his smooth facade returning though his eyes remained cold. "What was that?" "Probably just one of my hands clearing varmints." "From the grain storage," Elijah replied, rising unhurriedly from his chair. "If you'll excuse me for a moment, I should check." "Sit down, Blackwood," Kurtz growled, drawing his revolver and aiming it across the table. "No one's going anywhere until we see the girl and get those documents," Mrs. Holloway gasped, backing against the sideboard. Elijah remained standing, his expression unchanged, despite the gun pointed at his chest. "Robert Blackwell," he said quietly. "I thought I recognized you despite that scar. You've aged poorly since you and your brother murdered my wife and daughter." Kurtz, or Blackwell, bared his teeth in a savage grin. "Wondered if you'd make the connection, Blackwood." James said, "You might. He sends his regards, by the way." Walsh shot an irritated glance at his companion. "This is hardly the time for personal matters, Mr. Kurtz. We have business to conclude." He turned back to Elijah, his own revolver now resting on the table beside his coffee cup. "The girl and the documents, Mr. Blackwood, now, or this ends. Unpleasantly for everyone in this house." Elijah weighed his options. Matthews had returned, which likely meant Lieutenant Harker's men were securing the perimeter. But Walsh and his companions were armed and inside the house. One wrong move could turn the situation deadly. "The girl isn't here," he said finally. Walsh's expression hardened. "I don't believe you." "She left before dawn," Elijah continued, watching. "Blackwell's trigger finger for any telltale tension. Along with the documents you're so desperate to recover. By now, she's well beyond your reach." "You're lying," Blackwell snarled, rising halfway from his chair, gun still trained on Elijah's chest. "Am I?" "Check the house. You won't find her." Walsh studied Elijah for a long moment, then nodded to Delaney. "Search the premises. Thoroughly." As Delaney rose to comply, Elijah added, "You should know that copies of those documents are already on their way to federal authorities in 3 different locations. Whatever scheme you're protecting, it's already exposed." This was a bluff. Rebecca had taken the only copies with her, but Walsh's momentary flicker of alarm suggested it had hit its mark. The railroad man's composure cracked slightly, a flush of anger coloring his pale cheeks. "You have no idea what you've involved yourself in, Blackwood," he hissed. "This goes beyond a few ledger entries or land deeds. Men far more powerful than you have invested everything in this venture." "Men like Governor Harper?" Elijah asked, taking a calculated risk based on names he'd glimpsed in Rebecca's documents. Or Judge Williamson? Walsh's eyes widened slightly, confirming Elijah's suspicion. The corruption extended into the highest levels of territorial government, which explained how the Blackwell gang had evaded justice for so long. A shout from upstairs indicated Delaney had completed his search. Of the second floor, his heavy footsteps pounded down the stairs, and he burst into the dining room, his expression confirming what Elijah had already told them. "She's not here," Delaney reported, breathing heavily. "Checked every room. Closets, underbeds, nothing." Walsh slammed his fist on the table, rattling the china. "Where is she?" he demanded, his cultured veneer falling away completely now. "Where did you send her?" "Somewhere you'll never find her," Elijah replied calmly. "It's over, Walsh. Whatever fraud you've been orchestrating, whatever murders you've committed to cover it up, it all comes to light now." Blackwell laughed, an ugly sound devoid of humor. "You think this ends with us? The railroad employs hundreds. We have men in every town from here to Chicago. That girl won't live to see another sunrise once word gets out." "That assumes you'll be sending any word," Elijah countered, "which brings us to our current situation." As if punctuating his statement, the front door burst open. Lieutenant Harker entered, flanked by 4 armed soldiers, the reinforcements Matthews had successfully brought from Fort Wallace. They moved with practiced efficiency, weapons raised and ready. "Harrison Walsh," Harker announced formally, "you and your companions are under arrest by authority of the United States Army on suspicion of conspiracy, fraud, and murder." For a crucial instant, the room balanced on a knife's edge of tension. Blackwell's gun remained aimed at Elijah's chest, his scarred face twisted with calculation. Walsh's hand hovered near his own weapon on the table. Then several things happened at once. Blackwell shifted his aim from Elijah to Lieutenant Harker, clearly deciding that eliminating the military threat took priority. Walsh lunged for his revolver, and Elijah Blackwood, who had spent 8 years buried in grief and isolation, moved with the lightning reflexes that had once made him the fastest draw in Montana territory. His hidden Colt appeared in his hand as if by magic, clearing its holster and firing in one fluid motion. The bullet struck Blackwell's shoulder with surgical precision, spinning him away from Harker and sending his shot wild into the ceiling. In the same movement, Elijah's left hand swept the tablecloth upward, entangling Walsh's reaching fingers. Before they could close around his weapon, Delaney, caught between the soldiers at the door and Elijah's unexpected display of skill, hesitated fatally. By the time he decided to draw, 2 Army rifles were trained on his chest, and Corporal Wilson had entered through the kitchen, his carbine adding to the overwhelming firepower now commanding the room. "Weapons on the floor," Harker ordered, his young face stern with authority. "Now, or the next shot won't be aimed to wound." White-faced with pain, Blackwell slowly lowered his revolver to the floor with his uninjured hand. Walsh, still entangled in the tablecloth, glared at Elijah with undisguised hatred, but complied, releasing his grip on his weapon. Delaney, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, carefully placed his gun on the carpet. "Secure them," Harker instructed his men. "Corporal Wilson, see to Mr. Kurtz's wound. Enough to stop the bleeding, but don't waste too much sympathy. These men are responsible for 17 deaths on that wagon train, possibly more." As the soldiers moved to follow orders, Harker turned to Elijah, eyebrow raised in professional appreciation. "Impressive shooting, Mr. Blackwood. Glad to see that those stories about your skills weren't exaggerated." Elijah holstered his Colt, the familiar weight settling against his hip like an old friend too long neglected. "Been a while," he admitted. "Wasn't sure I still had it in me." "Where's the girl?" Harker asked, lowering his voice. "Headed north with Reed and Private Davis, through Carson Pass to Fort Collins." Elijah watched as the soldiers efficiently disarmed and bound the 3 prisoners. "She has documents implicating these men and others in massive fraud, land theft, embezzlement, bribery of officials." Harker nodded grimly. I suspected as much. Colonel Westfield has been investigating corruption in the territorial government for months. This could break the case wide open. He hesitated, then added, It was smart to send her north. We discovered this morning that the telegraph lines to Fort Wallace were cut yesterday. Someone inside the fort has been feeding information to Walsh's people. The confirmation of such widespread corruption sent a chill through Elijah. Rebecca was still in grave danger if the conspirators' network was as extensive as it appeared. I need to go after them, he decided aloud. Make sure they reach Fort Collins safely. I can spare 2 men to accompany you, Harker offered. The rest of us will take these prisoners back to Fort Wallace under heavy guard. Colonel Westfield will want to question them personally before transferring them to federal custody. As arrangements were made and the prisoners secured, Mrs. Holloway approached Elijah, her usual composure restored despite the chaos of the past hour. I'll prepare provisions for your journey, she said practically, and I'll have Samuel bring your mountain gear from storage. Elijah nodded his thanks, already mentally mapping the fastest route to intercept Reed and Rebecca. He didn't voice his growing concern that Walsh had been too confident, too certain of his resources. If the conspiracy reached as high as territorial, government and military command, nowhere was truly safe for Rebecca until those documents reached federal authorities beyond the conspirators' influence. One more thing, Mrs. Holloway added, her voice softening. That shot you made, Sarah would have been proud. She always said you were at your best when protecting others. The simple statement struck Elijah with unexpected force. For 8 years, he had avoided even the memory of who he had been when Sarah was alive. The man who had built this ranch not just as a business, but as a sanctuary for his family. The man whose skill with a gun had once been legendary throughout the territory. Not for violence, but for justice. I wasn't there when it mattered most, he said quietly, the old guilt surfacing. No, Mrs. Holloway agreed, her practicality returning. But you're here now. That girl needs you. Don't waste time on what can't be changed. Outside, as the soldiers loaded the prisoners into a wagon for transport, Elijah stood on his porch and watched the sun begin its westward journey. Somewhere in the mountains north of his ranch, Rebecca was riding toward what they hoped was safety, carrying documents that powerful men would kill to suppress. 8 years ago, he had failed to protect his family. Today, he had been given a second chance to use his skills not for vengeance, but for protection, to become again the man Sarah had loved, the father Emma had adored. Get my horse ready, he called to Samuel. We ride in 20 minutes. Carson Pass loomed ahead, its jagged peaks still capped with late spring snow, despite the June warmth in the valleys below. Elijah pushed his mount harder than was wise on the steep, rocky trail the 2 soldiers Harker had provided struggling to keep pace behind him. They had been riding for 6 hours, following the northern route Reed would have taken with Rebecca and Private Davis. So far, they had found only faint tracks, evidence of Reed's woodcraft and deliberate effort to conceal their passage. Need to rest the horses soon, Mr. Blackwood, called Sergeant Miller, the older of the 2 soldiers accompanying him. They won't make the high pass if we don't water them properly. Elijah knew the man was right, but every instinct urged him forward. The confrontation with Walsh and Blackwell had confirmed his worst fears. The conspiracy reached into the highest levels of territorial government. If other members of their network learned of Rebecca's escape, they would spare no resources to silence her. There's a creek about half a mile ahead, he conceded reluctantly. We'll stop there, briefly. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Elijah reined in sharply. Fresh hoofprints marked the muddy ground beside a fallen log, at least 5 horses moving at speed. The tracks crossed their path, heading northeast toward a shortcut that would intercept the main trail through Carson Pass. Those weren't made by Reed's party, Sergeant Miller observed, dismounting to examine the prints. Too many horses, and look here, these are military-issue horseshoes. Elijah felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. How long ago? Miller studied the impressions. 2 hours, maybe 3. Ground still damp where they disturbed it. Army patrol, suggested the younger soldier, Private Bennett. Not from Fort Wallace, Miller replied. Lieutenant Harker would have mentioned it. Unless they weren't under his command, Elijah said grimly. Walsh mentioned having men at the fort. If word reached them about his arrest, he didn't need to finish the thought. All 3 men understood the implications. Someone had sent riders to intercept Reed and Rebecca before they could reach Fort Collins. We need to cut them off, Elijah decided, studying the terrain ahead. There's an old hunting trail about 2 miles up that crosses over to Sentinel Ridge. If we take that, we might reach the pass before them. That's a mighty rough country, Miller warned. Barely passable this time of year. It's passable enough, Elijah insisted, already turning his horse toward the barely visible side trail. I've hunted these mountains for 15 years. The detour proved even more challenging than Miller had suggested. Twice they had to dismount and lead the horses over treacherous rock slides. A fallen pine blocked their path at one point, forcing them to hack through dense underbrush to circumvent it. Every delay increased Elijah's sense of urgency. The knowledge that Rebecca's life hung in the balance, driving him forward with grim determination. By late afternoon, they had reached Sentinel Ridge, a narrow, wind-swept plateau that offered a commanding view of Carson Pass below. Elijah raised his field glasses, methodically scanning the twisting trail that wound through the mountain valley. There, he said suddenly, adjusting the focus. About 4 miles south. Reed's party. Miller took the glasses, confirming Elijah's sighting. I see them. 3 riders moving steadily. They're having a good time. And there, Elijah pointed to another section of the trail, closer to the pass itself. 5 riders moving fast. They'll intercept Reed's group before they reach the pass. Calculations ran through Elijah's mind. Distances, terrain, time. We can't reach them before the interception, he concluded. But we can position ourselves above the pass to provide covering fire when they come through. If they make it that. Far! Miller said soberly. They'll make it, Elijah responded, his voice hard with certainty. Reed won't let them take the girl without a fight, and Davis is a good soldier. As they urged their mounts down the ridge toward the pass, Elijah tried not to think about the odds his friends faced. Reed was capable, but 5 armed men, especially if they were military, presented nearly impossible odds. They reached a defensible position above the narrowest section of the pass just as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks. Miller and Bennett quickly established firing positions behind large boulders, while Elijah scouted the approach from both directions. The sounds came before any visual confirmation, distant gunfire echoing off the mountain walls. 3 shots, in rapid succession, then a pause, then 2 more. That's a Springfield carbine, Miller identified. Army issue. Elijah's jaw tightened. So the pursuers were indeed military, or at least armed with military weapons. The knowledge only increased. His sense of urgency. Minutes stretched into an agonizing half-hour as they waited, the shadows lengthening across the pass. Then finally, movement on the southern approach, a single rider pushing a lathered horse at dangerous speed through the rocky terrain. It's the girl, Elijah said, recognizing Rebecca's slender form even at this distance. Alone. As she drew closer, they could see her condition, hat gone, hair streaming behind her, clinging to her mount with the desperation of someone who knows death follows close behind. Blood stained the left sleeve of her coat, though whether it was hers or someone else's was impossible to tell at this distance. Bennett, go down and guide her up to our position, Elijah ordered, his eyes never leaving the trail behind her. Miller, be ready to provide covering fire if her pursuers appear. The young private scrambled down the slope, moving with careful speed over the loose rock. He reached the trail, just as Rebecca's exhausted horse stumbled to a walk, the girl swaying dangerously in the saddle. Even from his elevated position, Elijah could see the moment Rebecca recognized Bennett's uniform, her posture stiffening with fear, hands clutching for reins to urge her mount away from this new threat. She thinks he's with the pursuers, Elijah realized aloud. Without hesitation, he stood from cover and called down, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air, "Rebecca, it's Elijah Blackwood. The soldier is with me." The girl's head snapped up, searching for him on the ridge. When she spotted him, the relief was visible even at this distance. She allowed Bennett to take her horse's reins, guiding her up the steep path to their defensive position. As they reached the top, Elijah saw the true state of her condition. Blood indeed stained her left arm from a bullet graze across her upper shoulder. Her face was scratched from branches she'd ridden through at speed, and exhaustion had left her pale and trembling. But her eyes burned with a fierce determination he recognized all too well. "Reed!" she gasped as Elijah helped her from the saddle. "Davis, they—" "Save your strength," he told her, guiding her to shelter behind the largest boulder. "We'll talk when you're safer." Miller handed her a canteen, which she drank from gratefully. As Elijah began to examine her wound, movement on the trail below caught his attention. "Riders coming," Miller warned, raising his rifle. 5 horsemen appeared, moving at a controlled trot rather than the all-out pursuit Elijah had expected. They wore army uniforms, though something about their formation struck him as undisciplined. "Hold fire," he told Miller. "Let's see their intentions first." The riders slowed as they approached the spot where Bennett had intercepted Rebecca. The leader, a heavy-set man with sergeant's stripes, pointed toward the ridge where Elijah's party had taken position, clearly having spotted their movement. "That's not a regular patrol," Miller muttered. "I know every sergeant at Fort Wallace, never seen him before." As if confirming their suspicions, the leader gave a hand signal, and his men spread out in a classic attack formation. One raised, a rifle aiming toward the ridge. "Down!" Elijah shouted, pulling Rebecca further behind the boulder as a shot cracked the air. The bullet struck rock above their heads, sending fragments flying. Miller returned fire immediately, his first shot striking one of the attackers in the shoulder, knocking him from his horse. Bennett followed suit, the 2 soldiers establishing a coordinated defense that kept the attackers pinned at the base of the ridge. "They're trying to circle around to the east," Elijah observed, noting 2 riders breaking away from the main group. He raised his rifle, leading the first rider slightly, and squeezed the trigger. The man tumbled from his saddle, while his companion quickly retreated back to the relative safety of the main trail. The firefight continued for several tense minutes, neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The attackers had cover behind rock outcroppings on the trail, while Elijah's group held the superior position on the ridge. During a momentary lull, Rebecca tugged urgently at Elijah's sleeve. When he turned, she pressed a folded paper into his hand, her eyes conveying the importance of whatever message it contained. He opened it quickly, reading her hastily scrawled words. "Reed and Davis stayed behind at a narrow canyon to hold them off. Reed was hit, but told me to ride for the pass, said you would find me." Elijah's expression hardened at the news. Reed, wounded, perhaps dead, and the loyal Private Davis likely sharing the same fate, all to protect this girl and the evidence she carried. "How many were following you?" he asked. Rebecca held up 8 fingers, then pointed down at the trail where only 5 attackers remained. 3 unaccounted for, Elijah told Miller. "Could be circling around to catch us from behind." The sergeant nodded grimly. "Bennett and I can hold this position. You need to get the girl to Fort Collins." "Not leaving you outnumbered," Elijah countered. "With respect, sir, that girl and those documents are more important than any of us." Miller's weathered face was resolute. "Army trained us for situations like this. If we don't hear from you in 3 days, Lieutenant Harker will send reinforcements from Fort Wallace." Before Elijah could argue further, movement in the pass below drew their attention. A single rider approached from the south. Not one of the attackers, but a familiar figure slumped painfully in the saddle. "That's Davis," Bennett exclaimed. The young private was barely staying on his horse, one arm hanging uselessly at his side, his uniform dark with blood. The attackers had spotted him too, and 2 broke cover to intercept him. "Cover me!" Elijah ordered, already moving down the slope at a controlled run, using the boulders for protection. Miller and Bennett opened fire, forcing the attackers back into cover and giving Elijah the opportunity to reach Davis. The wounded soldier nearly fell from his horse when Elijah appeared beside him. "Mr. Blackwood," he gasped, "the girl—" "She's safe," Elijah assured him, supporting Davis's weight as he guided the horse toward the ridge. "Where's Reed?" Davis's face contorted with pain and grief. "Didn't make it, sir. Took 3 of them with him, though. Fought like a demon to give us time to escape." The news hit Elijah like a physical blow. Thomas Reed had been more than a foreman. He'd been a friend, one of the few people Elijah had allowed close after losing his family. The knowledge that he'd died protecting Rebecca added a new weight of responsibility to Elijah's shoulders. With Miller and Bennett providing covering fire, Elijah managed to get Davis up to their position. Rebecca immediately tore strips from her shirt to help bind the soldier's wounds, her small hands working with surprising competence. "Can't stay here," Davis warned through gritted teeth. Those 3 unaccounted for, they rode ahead to set up an ambush at Granite Narrows, only place to cross the river between here and Fort Collins. Elijah studied their options. Night was falling rapidly, which provided both cover and danger. Traveling mountain trails in darkness risked fatal accidents, but remaining in place meant certain discovery come morning. "There's another way," he decided, "an old trapper's route that follows the western ridgeline. It's dangerous, especially in the dark, but it bypasses Granite Narrows completely." "You can't take the girl that way," Miller objected. "One misstep in the dark—" "I won't be taking her," Elijah replied, his mind made up. "You and Bennett. Will, Davis needs immediate medical attention, and Rebecca needs to reach federal authorities with those documents." He nodded toward the satchel still clutched tightly at her side. "And you, sir?" Bennett asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "I'll create a diversion. Make them think we're all heading east toward Granite Narrows. Once they commit to that direction, you take the western route." Elijah's tone left no room for argument. "I'll catch up when I can." Rebecca shook her head vehemently, scribbling rapidly on her paper. "Too dangerous. They'll kill you." "They can try," Elijah replied with grim confidence. "I know these mountains better than any of them, and I've got old scores to settle with men who wear that silver bracelet." Despite her exhaustion, Rebecca's eyes blazed with a stubborn fire as she wrote again, "I won't leave you behind." Not after Reed. The simple declaration struck Elijah with unexpected force. This girl, who had already lost so much, was refusing to accept another sacrifice on her behalf. For a moment, he saw Emma in her determined expression, the same unwavering loyalty, the same fierce heart. "It's not your decision," he said gently. "This is what Reed would want. What I want." He turned to Miller, outlining his plan in specific detail, how he would create a false trail leading toward Granite Narrows, drawing the pursuers away from the western route. How Miller and Bennett should proceed with Rebecca and the wounded Davis, using the night and terrain to their advantage. As the soldiers prepared the horses for the difficult journey ahead, Elijah found himself alone with Rebecca for a moment. The girl studied him with an intensity that seemed to look through his carefully constructed walls, seeing the man he had once been, and perhaps could be again. "I'll find you in Fort Collins," he promised her. "When this is over." Rebecca hesitated, then reached up and removed a small object that hung on a cord around her neck, a simple wooden charm carved into the shape of a sparrow. She pressed it into his hand, closing his fingers around it. The gesture needed no words, no explanation. It was both talisman and promise, a reason to return, a connection to hold on to in the darkness ahead. As Elijah helped her mount behind Sergeant Miller, she leaned down and, for the first time since he had known her, spoke aloud. Her voice was raspy from disuse, barely above a whisper, but the words were clear. "Find me." The simple phrase carried more weight than elaborate promises. Elijah nodded once, the wooden sparrow clutched tightly in his hand. "Count on it." He watched them depart, 4 figures gradually dissolving into the gathering mountain darkness. Only when they had completely disappeared from view did he turn his attention to creating the diversion that would give them the best chance of escape. As he worked, laying false trails and preparing carefully placed traps, Elijah felt a clarity of purpose he had not known in 8 years. The grief and guilt that had defined his existence since losing Sarah and Emma hadn't vanished, but they had transformed, becoming not a wall to separate him from the world, but a foundation upon which to build something new. Thomas Reed had given his life to protect an innocent child. Elijah would ensure that sacrifice wasn't in vain, and perhaps in doing so, find his own path back to the man he had once been. Autumn painted the Montana landscape in golds and crimsons. As a single rider approached Blackwood Ranch, 3 months had passed since the events at Carson Pass, 3 months of healing, justice, and gradual transformation. The ranch itself looked different now. Fresh paint brightened the main house, and new construction extended the east wing. The corrals held more horses than before, and children's voices could be heard from the direction of the small schoolhouse that had been built near the creek. Mrs. Holloway stood on the porch, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun as she watched the rider approach. When she recognized the visitor, a rare smile spread across her weathered face. "Mr. Blackwood," she called toward the barn. "Sheriff Thompson is here." Elijah emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. The past months had changed him, not just the healing scar that now ran along his jawline from the final confrontation with the remaining pursuers, but something more fundamental. He stood straighter, moved with purpose, and though his expression remained serious, it no longer held the closed, bitter quality that had defined him for 8 years. "Will?" he greeted the sheriff as the older man dismounted. "Didn't expect you until tomorrow." Sheriff Thompson removed his hat, revealing hair that seemed to have acquired more gray since spring. "Thought you'd want this news promptly." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew an official-looking envelope. "Just arrived from the federal court in Denver." Elijah accepted the envelope, recognizing the Justice Department seal. "Come inside. Mrs. Holloway's apple pie is cooling on the windowsill, and I suspect she'll share if asked politely." The housekeeper huffed, but led the way into the house. "As if I'd let good pie go to waste. Coffee's already on." Inside, the main house had undergone subtle but significant changes. The portrait above the fireplace remained, Elijah, Sarah, and Emma in happier times, but it had been joined by new photographs, Thomas Reed standing proudly beside his prize stallion, a group picture of the ranch hands, and a careful sketch of Rebecca, drawn by one of the children now living at the ranch. As Mrs. Holloway served coffee and generous slices of pie, Elijah opened the envelope, scanning its contents with practiced efficiency. "Guilty," he announced, looking up at the sheriff. "All 9 surviving conspirators, including Judge Williamson and Governor Harper, federal conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder." Thompson nodded with grim satisfaction. "Hanging offenses, most likely, especially with Rebecca's testimony." He took a sip of coffee. How is the girl? Still staying with the Marshall's family in Denver? For now, Elijah replied, his tone carefully neutral. The trial took longer than expected, but the telegram I received yesterday said they should be arriving next week. Mrs. Holloway made a small, satisfied sound. Just in time for the Harvest Festival. I'll need to prepare her room properly. The casual domestic discussion of Rebecca's return might have seemed ordinary to an outsider, but for Elijah Blackwood, a man who had spent 8 years in self-imposed isolation, it represented a seismic shift in his world. Marshall Bennett's report mentioned she's been having nightmares again, Thompson said carefully. The trial dredged up everything she'd been through. Elijah nodded, unsurprised. She'll have help here. Dr. Mitchell's daughter is good with the children. And Rebecca knows this is a safe place. The sheriff studied his old friend with knowing eyes. Never thought I'd see the day when Blackwood Ranch became a haven for orphaned children. Thomas Reed would be proud of what you've done with the place. The mention of Reed brought a momentary shadow to Elijah's expression. The foreman's body had been recovered from the canyon and buried on a quiet hillside overlooking the ranch. A place of honor for a man whose sacrifice had helped break open the largest corruption scandal in Montana Territory's history. It wasn't my idea, Elijah demurred, though without real conviction. Rebecca suggested it in her letters, said no child should face what she did alone. The "it" in question was the Blackwood Home for Children, a new purpose for the ranch that had emerged in the aftermath of the Carson Pass confrontation. While recovering in Fort Collins, Rebecca had written pages of suggestions, plans, and heartfelt arguments for transforming part of the ranch into a sanctuary for orphaned children of the frontier. To everyone's surprise, including his own, Elijah had embraced the idea with unexpected passion. The easternmost pastures had been sold to finance the construction of the schoolhouse and dormitory, and 5 children had already taken up residence under the care of a young teacher from Helena. Speaking of children, Thompson said, finishing his pie, young Tommy Weber's been asking about an apprenticeship. Says he wants to learn ranching from the best. He's a good kid, Elijah acknowledged. Tell him to come by next week. Reed always said we needed fresh blood in the operation. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Samuel Jenkins, now promoted to foreman after Reed's death. The young man entered with an apologetic nod to the sheriff. Sorry to interrupt, boss, but that army patrol is here again. Lieutenant Harker wants to know if you'll join them for the final inspection of the pass. Elijah checked his pocket watch. Tell him I'll be there in 10 minutes, and have Matthews saddle Penny. After Samuel departed, Sheriff Thompson raised an eyebrow. Final inspection? Harker's been assigned to establish a permanent outpost at Carson Pass, Elijah explained. Too many bandits and deserters are using it as a route to evade justice. Colonel Westfield wants my input on the defensive positions, Thompson chuckled. From recluse to military consultant, times do change. Some things had to change, Elijah said quietly, rising from the table. Well, before you go, there's something I'd like your opinion on. He led the sheriff to his study, once a sanctuary of isolation, now a functioning center of operations for both the ranch and the children's home. From his desk, Elijah withdrew a leather folder containing legal documents. Adoption papers, he explained, handing them to Thompson. I've had them drawn up, but wanted your thoughts before proceeding. Thompson scanned the documents, his bushy eyebrows rising. You're serious about this? Taking legal responsibility for Rebecca? She has no one else, Elijah said simply. Her brother's dead. Her parents died years ago. And after her testimony put half the territorial government in prison, there are still people who might hold grudges. It's a big step, Eli, from solitary rancher to father in one leap. Not such a leap, Elijah countered, looking toward the portrait of his first family. More like coming full circle. Thompson handed the papers back, his expression thoughtful. For what it's worth, I think Sarah and Emma would approve. That girl brought something back to life in you that's been dormant too long. After the sheriff's departure, Elijah rode with Lieutenant Harker's patrol to the Carson Pass construction site. The strategic outpost was taking shape rapidly. Barracks, stables, and a watchtower overlooking the Narrows where the confrontation had occurred. Soon, the passage would be secured against the outlaws and deserters who had long used it as a corridor for illicit activities. "We're naming it Reed Station," Harker informed him as they surveyed the progress. "Colonel's orders, fitting tribute to a brave man." Elijah nodded, appreciating the gesture. He'd be embarrassed by the attention, but honored all the same. As they completed their inspection, one of Harker's men approached with a telegram that had just arrived via courier from Fort Collins. The lieutenant read it quickly, then handed it to Elijah. "Thought you'd want to see this immediately," he said, an uncharacteristic smile breaking through his professional demeanor. "Good news for a change." The telegram was brief but momentous. Federal. Marshal Donovan with Rebecca, arriving Fort Wallace, stop traveling ahead of schedule, stop, expect arrival. Blackwood Ranch tomorrow afternoon. Stop girl. Insistent on returning, sooner stop. Papers proceeding as discussed. Stoplier felt an unfamiliar lightness in his chest as he read the message. Tomorrow. After 3 months of letters, telegrams, and waiting through the lengthy federal trial, Rebecca was coming home. The word struck him with its rightness. Home, not just to Blackwood Ranch, but to him. "Need to cut our inspection short," he told Harker, already turning toward his horse. "Have preparations to make it back at the ranch." The lieutenant smiled knowingly. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. Please give Miss Rebecca my regards. Tell her that the copy of Treasure Island I promised is waiting at the fort whenever she visits." The ride back to Blackwood Ranch gave Elijah time to reflect on the extraordinary journey of the past 4 months. From the isolated existence he had constructed after losing Sarah and Emma, to reluctant protector, to... what? Father again? The thought still carried echoes of guilt, as if embracing this new role somehow betrayed the family he had lost. Yet gradually, with each letter from Rebecca, each improvement to the ranch to make it welcoming for her return, each child given sanctuary in the new home bearing his name, Elijah had felt the grip of that guilt loosening. Sarah, he had come to realize, would have been the first to push him toward this new purpose. Mrs. Holloway was waiting when he returned, somehow already aware of the news, despite the telegram having gone directly to the pass. The ranch's informal intelligence network, Elijah suspected, was more efficient than the Army's official channels. "I've had the girls air out her room properly," the housekeeper announced without preamble, "and I'm baking those cinnamon rolls she asked about in her last letter. Samuel's already organized a welcome party with the children for tomorrow evening." Elijah dismounted, handing Penny's reins to a waiting stable hand. "I see everyone knows our business before I do." "Of course," Mrs. Holloway replied matter-of-factly. "This isn't just your home anymore, Mr. Blackwood. It's a community, and communities talk." The word caught him. Community. From self-imposed exile to the center of a growing community. All because a traumatized girl had been brought to his door one stormy night. That evening, after reviewing the ranch accounts, Elijah found himself drawn to Emma's old room. In the months since Rebecca's departure for the trial, he had gradually transformed it, preserving Emma's treasured possessions but making space for new life. The bookshelves now held both Emma's beloved stories and newer volumes that Rebecca had expressed interest in through her letters. On the bedside table sat a framed photograph recently sent from Denver, Rebecca standing proudly beside Marshal Donovan on the courthouse steps after the verdict. Though still solemn, her face showed a determination and hope that had been absent when she first arrived at Blackwood Ranch. Beside this photo was another, much older. Emma, at age 10, sitting on Penny's back while Elijah steadied her, Sarah watching with a mother's mixture of pride and concern. For the first time in 8 years, Elijah could look at this image without being consumed by grief and guilt. "I think you'd like her," he said quietly to the photograph. "She has your stubbornness, Emma, and your sense of justice, Sarah." The next day dawned clear and crisp, the aspens surrounding the ranch house shimmering gold in the autumn light. Elijah rose early, checking and rechecking preparations with an attention to detail that both amused and pleased Mrs. Holloway. By noon, the entire ranch was buzzing with anticipation. The children from the home had created welcome signs, and Samuel had organized an impromptu honor guard of ranch hands to greet Marshal Donovan, a federal official whose visit constituted the most significant event in Promise Creek's recent history. Elijah found himself pacing on the porch, checking his pocket watch with uncharacteristic frequency. When he caught Mrs. Holloway smiling knowingly at his nervous energy, he forced himself to sit in one of the rocking chairs, attempting to project his usual calm. "It's all right to be excited, Mr. Blackwood," the housekeeper said as she brought him coffee. "It's a big day." Before he could respond, young Jimmy Porter, one of the orphans now living at the home, came tearing up the path from his self-appointed lookout position on the ridge. "They're coming!" he shouted, his voice cracking with excitement. "2 riders just past the south marker." Elijah stood, adjusting his coat and straightening his collar, in a gesture that reminded Mrs. Holloway powerfully of the day Sarah and Emma had returned from visiting relatives in Helena years ago. The same mixture of anticipation and barely contained joy had animated his movements then. The ranch hands formed their informal honor guard along the main approach, while the children gathered on the porch steps, fidgeting with excitement. Samuel Jenkins stood at the gate, ready to officially welcome the federal marshal to Blackwood Ranch. As the riders came into view, Elijah felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. Marshal Donovan rode first, his official bearing unmistakable, even at a distance, and beside him, sitting straight and proud on a chestnut mare that could have been Penny's younger sister, was Rebecca. The 3 months in Denver had changed her. She sat taller, more confident, and her hair, longer now, was braided in a style similar to that in the portrait of Emma above the fireplace. She wore a new blue riding dress, and as she drew closer, Elijah could see that the vacant, traumatized expression that had defined her when she first arrived had been replaced by something more complex, a solemn wisdom beyond her years, but lightened now by unmistakable hope. When she spotted Elijah waiting on the porch, Rebecca's composure briefly cracked. She urged her horse forward, outpacing the marshal, and by the time she reached the ranch house, there were tears streaming down her face despite her smile. Elijah moved down the steps to help her dismount, but she surprised him by practically launching herself from the saddle into his arms. The impact nearly knocked him backward, but he steadied himself, returning her embrace with equal fervor. "You're back," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. Rebecca pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes bright with tears and determination. "I told you I would be." Her voice was stronger now, the disuse of those traumatic days replaced by a quiet confidence. "This is home." The word echoed his own thoughts from yesterday, and Elijah felt something finally settle into place within him, the last piece of a picture that had been incomplete for 8 long years. Marshal Donovan approached, respectfully, giving them a moment before clearing his throat. "Mr. Blackwood, the paperwork is proceeding as planned. Judge Anderson was most impressed with your establishment here and the references provided by Lieutenant Harker and Sheriff Thompson." Elijah nodded his thanks, still keeping one arm around Rebecca's shoulders. "We're grateful for your escort, Marshal. I hope you'll stay for dinner. Mrs. Holloway has prepared something special." As they moved toward the house, the children overcame. their initial shyness, and swarmed around Rebecca, each eager to tell her about the changes at the ranch, the new schoolhouse, the kittens that had been born in the stable last week. Watching her interact with them, patient, gentle, but with a newfound confidence, Elijah saw glimpses of the woman she would become. The trauma would always be part of her, just as his own losses would always be part of him, but it would not define her future. That evening, with Marshal Donovan settled in the guest room and the celebration dinner concluded, Elijah found Rebecca sitting on the porch swing, staring up at the stars that blanketed the Montana sky. "Cold out here," he observed, draping a blanket around her shoulders before sitting beside her. "I miss this," she replied. "In Denver, there were too many lights to see the stars properly." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sound the gentle creaking of the swing and the distant lowing of cattle being settled for the night. "Marshal Donovan brought the final adoption papers," Elijah said eventually. "Judge Anderson has reviewed everything and found it satisfactory, but," he added carefully, "nothing is signed yet. The decision remains yours." Rebecca turned to look at him, her expression serious beyond her years. "Do you want me to stay, to be—" She hesitated on the word. "Your daughter." "I want you to be wherever you feel safe and happy," Elijah answered honestly. "And yes, I want you here. But I would understand if I want to stay," she interrupted, her voice firm. "I want this to be home, not because I have nowhere else, but because this is where I choose to be." She reached for his hand, her small fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. "I know I'm not Emma. I won't ever try to replace her. No one." "Good," Elijah agreed gently. "Just as no one could replace your brother or the Parkers who died protecting you. But perhaps that's not what this is about. Perhaps it's about building something new that honors them all." Rebecca nodded, understanding in her eyes that once again reminded him of her extraordinary journey from traumatized victim to survivor. "The children's home was your idea," he continued, "giving others what you needed most, safety, understanding, a place to heal. What we both needed," she corrected softly. "You were just as alone as I was." The simple truth of her statement struck Elijah deeply. This remarkable child had seen through his carefully constructed isolation to the wounded heart beneath, and had offered him the same sanctuary he had provided her. "So," he said, "Rebecca Blackwood has a certain ring to it." For the first time since her return, she smiled fully, the unguarded expression of a 13-year-old girl, rather than the solemn survivor she had been forced to become. "It does, doesn't it?" As they continued swinging gently beneath the vast Montana sky, Elijah reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment, a massacre that had left only one survivor, a reluctant rancher forced to confront his own past, and now a new beginning built upon the foundations of shared loss and mutual healing. The only girl left from the Wagon Massacre had found not just sanctuary, but family. And Elijah Blackwood, the grizzled rancher who had lost his daughter, had found not a replacement for his beloved Emma, but a new purpose, a new heart, and, most unexpectedly of all, a new hope for the future. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.